Our quote for the day comes from a mom who had to begin homeschooling during the pandemic. Does anyone know the number that parents are supposed to call if I need a substitute teacher? Today is Wednesday of Easter week and Wednesday of the octave of Easter. And the church today gives us the road to Emmaus, where the two disciples were leaving Jerusalem and walking that 7-mile journey, and the Lord begins walking with them. This is the afternoon of Easter. This is later in the day after Jesus had risen from the dead early in the morning. I'm sure it appeared to our Blessed Mother, then to Mary Magdalene, and then he decides, because he has so much energy after the resurrection, he decides to take a 7-mile walk. That's how much energy Jesus had. He just was willing. But he did this on purpose because he wanted the church to have this witness of these two disciples on the road to Emmaus. Now, these two disciples were very disheartened. They were disillusioned. They were walking away from the church. Where was the church? It was the 11 apostles in the upper room. That was the church in Jerusalem, and they were walking away from the church. They were going back to their home in Emmaus. Now, one of them is named, and that is Cleopas. Cleopas, also known as Clopas. And we know that his wife Mary, whose relic is in our altar, was at the foot of the cross. Many of the scholars know that, of course, that was Cleopas, because he's mentioned. The other follower of Jesus is not mentioned. And the speculation is that is because, the author, St. Luke, wants us to put ourselves in that place as the other disciple walking along the road with Cleopas. The other speculation is that it's St. Luke, the author of this gospel. That was the other disciple, because we know that these two men or these two individuals were not apostles. They were other followers of Christ, other disciples. Now, some of the scripture scholars, including one of my favorites, Dr. John Bergsman, makes a good point. He believes it is Cleopas and his wife, Mary, the wife of Clopas, who was at the foot of the cross. He says because they were discussing and arguing and debating, it proves they must have been married because they were arguing, right? They had just spent all this time in isolation and quarantine, and now they were debating with each other. And it makes sense that they were going back to their home. And if that's the case, it's very fascinating to have this husband and wife meet the Lord. One of the first people he met perhaps was a husband and wife after he rose from the dead. And they were discussing, and they were very sad. They were disillusioned. They were heartbroken. But notice how Jesus changes their hearts from being heartbroken to being hearts on fire, the hearts that were burning for love of God after the Lord explained the scriptures to them. And the Lord, of course, shows his great sense of humor, because he, first of all, hides his own identity. He says, "What are you two talking about?" And they said, "Don't you know what happened in Jerusalem?" And the Lord just says, "What things? What sort of things?" Again, he's trying to draw them out, and they explain why their hopes were dashed, because the Lord had come into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. They thought he was going to be the Messiah to kick out the Romans and restore Israel, to redeem Israel. But the Lord, they believed, everything ended in failure. He was turned over, scourged, crucified, and now his body is missing. And they even say some women went to the tomb early and other apostles went, and they could not find his body. And then even an angel said that he was alive. Again, why were they leaving Jerusalem when all these things were happening? They couldn't find the body. But it seems that they were just disillusioned and sad, downcast, and so they decided to go back home. Well, this is a 7-mile journey. If it takes 20 minutes to walk a mile, Jesus spent 2.5 hours with them, and he then unfolded for them all the passage in Scripture in the Old Testament that referred to him and all the prophecies he fulfilled. If you want to read a good book about this, read the Emmaus Code by David Limbaugh, Rush Limbaugh's brother. David Limbaugh, a Christian apologist, goes through the Emmaus Code where he describes all the Old Testament passages that Jesus probably talked about, about he was the seed to crush the head of the serpent. He was the ram caught by its horns in the thicket. He was the Passover lamb. He was a suffering servant of Isaiah. He was the fulfillment of Psalm 22, where they have pierced my hands and my feet, they have numbered all my bones. That Jesus then gave them the world's greatest Bible study in 2.5 hours. And the thing is, none of it's recorded. We don't know. It would have been wonderful to walk along, but that's what we have the ability to study Scripture and the Old Testament to show how Jesus fulfilled all of these prophecies. So we actually can learn through our study of Scripture and the Old Testament how Jesus fulfilled every one of those. And then the gospel concludes by Jesus indicating he was going to keep walking, but when they got to their home, notice Jesus did not force himself into their lives. He pretended to go on further. He wanted them to invite him into their home. Jesus does not force himself into our lives. We have to invite Jesus into our lives, into our hearts, into our homes. And so they said, stay with us. It's getting dark. And so then they have a meal. Now, normally, Jesus was the guest, and yet he does the role of the host. He's the one who takes the bread, blesses it, and then distributes it. This was unheard of. Normally, if you go to somebody's house, you don't take over. But they were the ones that were giving this dinner, and yet Jesus did these 4 things that's mentioned when he multiplied the loaves and at the Last Supper. 4 things. He took the bread, said the blessing, broke the bread, and gave it to them. Those 4 things, we hear this at every Mass as well. And then they recognized him. Jesus allowed himself to be known in the breaking of the bread, which of course is the Eucharist, the glorified body, blood, soul, and divinity of the Lord. So notice what happens at Emmaus. It is really the Mass, the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist. Jesus gives us the liturgy of the Word by talking to them and explaining the Scriptures to them, and then he reveals himself to them in the breaking of the bread. And that happens every single time we come to Mass. We have the Scriptures, we have Old Testament readings, Psalm, New Testament, Gospel, we have the homily. That's all to prepare our hearts and minds for the grace to truly recognize the real presence of Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament.